Well, today we're going to talk to you about mounting an ICF system on a Geringhoff corn head. And when you get your ICF system from us aftermarket, you're going to get it in a crate like this. It's going to come with all of these parts in here. And also in there, there's going to be a listing of the parts that are in here, and an assembly manual and a parts manual. And the first thing you want to do when you get this kit is you want to unpack all this crate, lay everything out, make sure that we've sent everything that you need for this, check against the list, look at the parts book, and just make sure that it's all here. I've done the inventory on all my parts. I'm happy with, I've got everything I need. I'm ready to start the installation. Before you start doing installation, make sure that you have the proper equipment for doing it. There are some of these components that are somewhat heavy. Either have a lift to hold them in place or a helper, and wear the proper personal protection, safety glasses, whatever else you may need, gloves, work safely. So the first step of the installation is to mount the arms, but before we can do that, we have to have brackets to mount the arms too. If you have a head with the brackets already welded on, you can skip this step and go right on to the next step. But if not, we have to mount the brackets. This is half of the bracket here. We need to mount these to the head. And in the installation assembly guide, there's a chart in here that's going to give you the dimensions where these have to be for your particular head. You know, whether it be a 12-30, 12-row 30, 8-row 30. This one here happens to be a 12-row 22. So it's going to be different dimensions for each of those different heads. So being a 12-22, my first two arms in the middle are going to be mounted 2,226 millimeters left and right of the center. So 1,118 millimeters each side of center. So starting here in the center, this particular head is welded right here with the tubes right in the center, so I've already got it located. Otherwise, find a place to measure from, locate the center of the frame, mark it, and make your measurement. So right there, I have my 1,118 millimeters. For the outer arm, it's 5,590 or 2795 from center. So I get my center, measure across the head, and make my marks. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to get these spots ready. So I've got my marks here. I held my bracket in place and marked my outside edges of the bracket. These brackets, when we're all done with assembly, are going to be welded in place. For now, when we're doing the initial assembly, it's bolted. For the final welding, we're going to want to have all this paint removed. So before you mount any brackets, take and remove this paint. I've used a flap wheel on a hand grinder, but just take the paint off here, take the paint off of the matching surface on the brackets. Once you've done that, we're ready to mount the brackets in place. I have a bracket that's mounted in place. The important thing to look at with these brackets when you're putting them on is this is an oval tube, and the bracket is formed to fit fairly closely. So when you're putting it on, make sure that we get the bracket as tight to this oval tube as we can. Once we're satisfied that we're pretty close, tighten these bolts up, hold it in place. And we repeat that process all the way across for all four brackets. If this is a two-arm head, then we just have the two center brackets. The reason we're not going to weld this right now is that just in case something isn't quite where we want it to be, we may have to reposition these just a little bit one way or the other through the process. So we want to leave these so we have that option that we can move them if we have to. So for now, just tighten them up. So I've got all my locations for the brackets measured out. I've ground my paint where I need to grind paint for the welds for later. I've installed the first bracket here and tightened it up where I want it to be. Now I'm going to move over to the next one here. And one of the things I like to do before we actually install this bracket is going to remeasure this just to make sure everything is where it needs to be. Then after I've got my bracket where I want it to be, I just want to make sure that it's going to fit around this tube correctly, that the flat surfaces match up with the flat surface on the tube here. Everything looks good, so now I'd be ready to tighten these bolts up. I'm going to tighten the top ones a little bit, I'm going to tighten the bottom ones a little bit, alternate back and forth, pull this bracket up tight, evenly top and bottom so that it doesn't twist on the frame and it stays in place where I want it to be. So after we got our mounting brackets put on the head, or if our brackets are already there, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to pre-assemble this tube. It's a tube with this gear drive that goes on the end, and it goes between the two center arms to make it so that they are kept in time with each other. Basically, it's a mechanical flow divider. And we just pre-assemble this before we assemble the arms, because then we can put this on at the same time as we're putting on the center two arms. So we take this gear assembly, insert it into the end of the tube so that the bolt holes line up. And then we would just take our bolts here and start them in loosely and leave them loose. We'll tighten these later after we have it assembled on the head. After we've pre-assembled this portion here, we're going to attach it to the mounting brackets on the head.
Okay. Next one. Nope.
So we found out that our brackets here were just a little bit too wide. And so we had to loosen them back up and move them over just a little bit. Had we welded these already, we wouldn't have been able to do that. We would have had to grind the weld out and cut it off. But since we have not welded it yet, we'll just loosen it up, move it to where we need it to be, tighten it back up. And what we did is, because we want these to be equal, we move both sides in about the same amount. In this case, about 1/8 of an inch. Our next step then is to install the 4 arms. We'll start with the 2 in the middle. And one of the things that we want to make sure that we do when we do this is that there is the gear here on the end. There's also a mating gear on the arm. And we want to make sure that both the left and the right arms are in the same teeth on the gear here so that they're equal and they go up and down. This is one of the things where it's good to have a helper or have a hoist or a crane to support the arm. These are heavy arms with the motor and the counterweight. Take care to have the proper equipment and help. We've lifted the arm in place, and it's secured in place with 2 pins like this, one for the arm and one for the hydraulic cylinder here and here. And then these pins are later retained with a bolt through this hole here, and they're a self-threaded, self-tapping bolt. We want to check the teeth on both sides, that our teeth are in the same position. And I just look at where the tooth is and the bolt, and where the tooth behind is, and they look the same on both sides. Down a little. Okay. I talked earlier when we were going through our parts inventory that we have the 4 arms and that the outside ones can be either side. But I see during the pre-assembly, the guys that did the pre-assembly actually put the fittings in these cylinders already for the specific side they're on. So this one is marked on the fittings A, and it's A, B, C, D, starting from left to right, from standing behind the head. So this being the A side, this cylinder goes here. So this arm here is the D arm. He's marked the fittings here as D. Okay. These cylinders are plumbed that you could plumb them on either side, but in the pre-assembly here, they've actually put the fittings in that we're going to use to connect hoses later. Everything's already set for us and done. So in this case, it does make a difference whether it's A or D. So after we've got our arms put on with these and held in place with the pins, we want to retain these pins to make sure they don't come out. We're just going to put a bolt through here and secure them with bolts so that the pins will stay in place. After we've secured our arms, we're now ready to put this support tube in, and this tube goes through these fittings here on each of the arms. On each side of this arm, we're going to put this lock ring on here as well, and so we have to slide that over this tube as we slide the tube on, one for each side of the arm. So there's two for each arm. And just make sure that the recess is pointing the right direction as you slide them on. Sometimes these are a little bit tight on this aluminum tube here, and you may need to take and just buff them out a little bit with a buffing wheel or a die grinder just to make them a little looser fit so they'll slide on here better. For this application, for this particular head, our tube is all one piece. On some heads, depending on how wide we are, we can't do it with just one single tube, and so we'll be sending you two tubes, and they'll have a splice that goes in the middle. So half the tube will come in from the right-hand side here, half is going to come in from the left. And then when you get to put the two pieces in the middle, and then there's a metal plate that comes over the top here, and two bolts on each side will lock these two halves together. Once it's all in, we'll take and turn these eccentric rings till they're tight, tighten the set screw and lock it in place. Well, we've got our tube all installed. Now we've got our eccentric rings put on as we went across. Now the next step would be to tighten these rings, slide them into place, set the eccentric onto the recess, and tighten the set screw. The last part of this assembly is to put this plug into the end of the tube here. And before we actually put it in, we'll put a little silicone on it, and just to make sure it doesn't fall out and hold it in place. I'm using silicone, but any suitable adhesive will work. Just something to help make sure this plug stays in the tube. We've finished all of the mechanical assembly we want to do right now. So at this point, we're going to start putting on the central hydraulic system. One of the first things we put on is a plate that goes in here to protect the components from any trash coming up from below. And if it has an end row auger system on it, we're going to remove the existing tubes here, because this is where our central hydraulic is going to mount. After we have our plate mounted in the center here, and we've removed the existing hydraulics for the end row augers, before we can mount our central hydraulic system here, we have to put these brackets on to hold the central hydraulics in place. They're held on with bolts through holes that are already in the frame. They're covered with a little tape disc here, and you just find the holes, pull the tape off, and then we position the bracket and mount it in place with self-tapping bolts. Brackets are all mounted in place, so our next step would be to install the central hydraulic system. The holes on these brackets are slotted, and so as we put the hydraulic system on and get it in place, we may need to adjust these brackets a little bit so we have a good fit to the mating bracket on the central hydraulic system. This is the hydraulic system as we're going to be sending it to you. all pretty much pre-assembled. The pipe here in the back is what's going to fit into the slots on these brackets here. It's just a matter of lifting it up in place and setting it in. In addition to the hooks down here at the bottom this pipe fits into, there are also 2 retaining bolts that will go on each side of the hydraulic block that go into the frame just above where we put that splash plate in earlier. After we've got our central hydraulic system in place and bolted it tight, we can now remove all the zip ties that secure these hoses in place and start getting them in place. The first thing we're going to assemble here is we're going to mount this flow divider to the back of the frame here. The flow divider is for the reel fore and aft function on the reel. So we'll do that next. After we have this installed, the next step would be to attach all the hoses to the bulkhead fittings. They're all labeled with identification, and the hoses will be labeled accordingly. So this one says A4.1, A4.2, and A5. And we'll see that we got A4.1, 4.2, and 5 corresponding on this bulkhead fitting here. And then we would repeat this process over on the other side of the frame. There's also another set of bulkhead hoses labeled for bulkhead fittings, and the same thing. The bulkhead plate is going to be laser cut with the hose connections that go there, and the hoses themselves will be identified with that location. After we've connected our bulkhead hoses, the next hoses we would connect are the ones for the deck plates. And we would remove the existing deck plate hoses from the connection down here at the bulkhead and install these hoses in their place. Okay, after we have all our bulkhead hoses connected, then our next step is going to be to lay in the hoses that go on this connection tube here, the stabilizer pipe. And these are going to be the hoses that connect to all the cylinders on the arms and then connect back to the bulkhead fittings here for all our functions. So when they get the fittings, the hoses and the pipes are all pre-installed. They're all like the other ones, labeled as to where they go. AR3, AR4, there are going to be fittings on those cylinders that will have labels that match up to those. So it's just a matter of deciding which way to lay this on here. We know that A is over on the left-hand side of the head. We would turn this around so that when we cut the straps and unfold it, that the A hoses go to the left side and the D hoses go to the right side. So we've got it laid out here. A couple things to explain to you about how these hoses are labeled and how they match up with the arms. Standing from the back side of the head, looking forward, left and right. So all the hoses on the far arm here on the A arm, their fittings are all on the right-hand side of the cylinders. So the lettering is AR 1, 2, 3, and 4 because there's 4 fittings there, and they're all on the right-hand side of the cylinder. Whereas here we have the B arm, and it's labeled BL2. So B arm, left side, hose number 2. And there's going to be a matching tag on here that says BL2 for B arm, left side, number 2. On this side, it's BR1. So the next step that we do after we kind of have this laid out is we're going to have to drill holes for these brackets and put self-tapping bolts in here. And pretty much where the brackets are is going to be a good place to mount them, but you can measure if you want to get them centered and spaced out equally, but they should be pretty close. We have our tubes all mounted in place and bolted tight, so now we'd be ready to start connecting our hoses. One thing about mounting these clamps here, some tubes may have holes in them already, and if they are already there, just use those holes. You don't have to drill new ones if they're already there. They'll be in the right locations. So one thing to note about hooking these hoses up, besides just that they're labeled, is you may have to loosen this connection back here to be able to turn the hose to make the elbows connect the right way. They don't necessarily always line up, and you may have to reposition them. So we'll go ahead and we'll get all our lines hooked up to the hydraulic cylinders here. So once we've got all our lines connected, one thing you want to make sure you do is go through and check every fitting that they're tight, because most of these fittings are going to only be finger tight because they know doing the pre-assembly you're going to have to reposition these hoses. So it's a good idea just to go back through and check every fitting and make sure they're tight. We would reinstall the hoses for the end row augers that we removed earlier. What we used earlier won't be reused. Everything we need is now part of this central hydraulic system, and we just put the new hoses to the old fittings. After that, we would then protect all these hoses at these 2 bulkheads with this spiral hose or spiral belt, and we just wrap it on there, holds these hoses tight and keeps them protected. And after that, our next operation is going to be to replace this single point. So what we'll do next is we'll remove this single point and we'll install a new one with different fittings and different application. So we'll go ahead and do that. After we've got our hoses reconnected for our end row augers, then we would take some clamps here and clamp these hoses in place so they're secured and won't get in the way of anything and won't get damaged. We'll do that next. So we've got our hoses clamped in place. We've got our protective belting put on these hoses. We've removed our old single point. We're ready to install our new one. The differences you're going to see here is on this new one, we've added in this valve here. This valve is for selecting whether we're going to run the reel and the end row augers together or just the end row augers. For our single point here, this kit comes set up to go 2 different ways. If it's got end row augers, it's already plumbed for it. If your head does not have end row augers, there will be parts in the kit for plumbing it, and we have to put this T-fitting in here, this hose, and this connector to connect this back to here. And that's if you don't have end row augers. Single point's all installed and plumbed, ready to start testing the hydraulic system. So before we want to do that, as I said before, when we were connecting the hoses here, just go through and check all the fittings, make sure they're tight. And we have one last operation to do before we can hook hydraulics up to this and start bleeding the system and testing it. And that is, we have our existing wiring harness for our deck plate and speed sensor that was already on the head. In our kit, we have another wiring harness that plugs into the computer here, and we need to connect these 2 together. And then we have this wiring harness that's going to connect to our monitor up in the cab, and we need to route it to the edge of this assembly as well. And then we'll be ready to start bleeding the oil and getting all the air out of the system and doing those tests. So after we've connected our wiring harness here for the deck plate and the monitor, and we've routed our cable for our monitor up in the cab, the next thing we need to do before we can bleed the system out is we have to install a new monitor in the cab. We have to install this monitor here with the 4 buttons across the bottom, the multi-function monitor. This is going to give us the functionality to control our deck plates and the raising and the lowering of the reel and the fore and aft of the reel. So completely take out the monitor that's in the cab and the wiring harness for that monitor. Then this monitor will go up in the cab. This junction box goes up in the cab, has a port to plug the monitor into, cigarette plug wiring for powering the system, and then another port here for a wiring harness that comes up from the head. So this is the wiring harness that comes from the head here up to the cab. On the end of the harness, we have 4 different wires. They're color-coded. Inside this box is a chart that matches up the color coding. Route this up from the head through the floor of the cab somewhere, some opening into the cab, get it into the cab, hook it into this junction box, hook everything together, and then we'd be ready to operate the head and bleed the oil system out. So we've completed all our hydraulics and electrical installation for now. You're probably wondering why we haven't put our front tube in here yet. Well, as we bleed this system out, the arms are going to tend to not want to go up together. They're going to be out of time, and we do run the risk of bending the tube in the front if we have it installed. So what we're going to do is, before we install the tube, we're going to bleed the system out. Be careful when you're bleeding it that you don't run the cylinders too fast or too far. Work them back and forth slowly. Try and get them as close to in time with each other as we can, so that we don't put a lot of excess strain on the different tubes on the back, because they are going to move a little bit different as they go. So we'll go ahead and we'll bleed the system out. We would select for the reel lift, and then using your fore and aft function on the combine, operate the system to get the air out. Hold the lever a little bit at each end of the stroke to make sure we get all the air worked out of the system. We can switch on the monitor to go to the reel fore and aft. And then once we're happy with it, that we have the air out of the system, we'll just extend the reel arms forward. And then lower the reel arms down to a height that's comfortable to work on. our next step now is going to be to install the reel tube for the fingers all the way across. There's a set screw, and what we want to do with this set screw is install it into this coupler here. And what that's going to do for us is it's going to keep this hub in place and in line where we want it to be while we insert the tube, so nothing will move. After we get the tube in, we'll put 2 retaining bolts on. We'll take our set screw back out and put the 3rd retaining bolt on, and then we'll repeat the same on the other side. The support tube in the center, there's an eccentric ring that goes on each of these bearings to lock it in place, so we want to make sure that we install that as well. Okay. And the set screw makes it much easier. So then after we've got the tubes installed, we just want to make sure that they float freely between the arms. And then we would take our eccentric ring here and get it on the recess and tighten it up and lock it in place. And now we have the reel tube installed. The next thing we're going to do is going to install the paddles. And we have a plug that goes in each end here. And like the plug on the support tube in the back, we just put a little silicone around it and drive it in. The paddles are going to come to you pre-assembled. They're going to look like this when you get them. And all you have to do, take one bolt out. Just work it around onto the shaft like that. Align it with the center of the row. And put the bolt in. And just repeat that across the head. Once you're got them all on, come back through, tighten all 3 bolts, tighten each of them a little bit at a time so we pull it up evenly all the way around. And that would complete the installation of the paddles. Pay attention to the angle of the paddle, the direction that the bend is at. We want it so that as it pulls the crop in, as it gets to the back of its rotation, it drops the crop. If you turn the other way, it's going to hook the crop and pull it back around with the reel and throw it out in front. Now that we've got our paddles put on, it leaves just a couple things left for us to do on the assembly. We want to, at this point now, we're going to want to weld these brackets in place. But before we do that, we're going to want to check to make sure that our arms are about where they should be all the way across. They're not going to be exact, that's why we're going to adjust them. But look at our bracket to make sure that it's around the oval tube as good as it can be, and then come in and weld the bracket on both sides and then repaint it. And then we can go and set the height of the reel itself, the height that the reel is above the crop and above the gathering chains. And we do that by measuring from the bottom of the tube where the paddles are mounted to the top of the idler sprocket for the gathering chains. And that's with the reel all the way down and the fore and aft fully extended forward. And then we come back to these cylinders here, and on the rod there's a place to put a wrench, loosen the jam nut, and we can turn this rod in and out of this eye bolt to raise and lower the reel. And the measurement we're looking for is 375 millimeters. And once we've got that, we lock the jam nut back in place and we're done. So we need to go up, so we're going to extend this rod on the cylinder. The reason we want it at 375 is that way that when we're operating the reel, whether it's all the way out in the front or somewhere in the middle or all the way to the back, it's not going to be getting into the gathering chains. It's going to clear them through the whole motion of the travel. After setting our height and getting our reel paddles here all level across, the last thing we would do before we put all the covers on everything would be to test run the reel. So make sure that all your protective devices are in place, all the shields are in place on any moving parts. And then we'd start the combine up and engage the header and test the operation, make sure that the reel's turning the right direction, that the end row augers turn the right direction, that the reel functions properly up and down, in and out, just like when we were testing it before when we bled the system out. If everything tests out real good that way, we're happy with everything, then we would take and put all the covers over the hydraulics and electrical, and we'd be done with the installation.